The Richards family seemed to have it all. Nestled in the heart of an affluent Scottsdale, Arizona neighborhood, their home stood as a testament to success and harmony. A pristine lawn stretched before their modern two-story house, framed by meticulously trimmed hedges and towering palm trees. Neighbors often paused to admire the picture-perfect property, a beacon of stability in a world of chaos. Inside, Sophie Richards embodied the quintessential wife and mother. Warm, gracious, and endlessly supportive, she was the glue that held the family together. Her husband, Jack Richards, was a rising star in real estate, known for his charisma and ability to close even the toughest deals. Together, they raised two bright, energetic children, both excelling in school and brimming with potential. Their life, from the outside, seemed untouchable. Sophie was not only admired for her familial devotion but also for her active role in the community. She organized charity drives, hosted neighborhood gatherings, and was the first to welcome new families with a basket of homemade treats. Her best friend, Rebecca Morgan, was often by her side. The two women had been inseparable since their college years, their friendship weathering the storms of adulthood. Rebecca was the opposite of Sophie in many ways. While Sophie exuded domestic warmth, Rebecca was bold, independent, and magnetic. A single woman with an adventurous spirit, she thrived on spontaneity and lived life unapologetically on her terms. Yet, despite their differences, Sophie trusted Rebecca completely. To Sophie, Rebecca wasn't just a friend, she was family. Rebecca was a frequent guest at the Richards' home. She knew the children's schedules, had a spare key for emergencies, and even had her favorite chair in the family's sunlit kitchen. Sophie often joked that Rebecca spent more time at their house than her own. The children adored Aunt Rebecca, and Jack seemed at ease around her, sharing the occasional laugh over a glass of wine during casual dinners. But as the saying goes, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface of this idyllic suburban life, cracks had begun to form, tiny, imperceptible at first, but widening with each passing day. Sophie, ever perceptive, occasionally felt a fleeting unease she couldn't quite place. It was the kind of feeling that whispered, something isn't right, but lacked the evidence to back it up. Jack, once the epitome of a dedicated husband, had started to change. He worked longer hours, often returning home late with vague excuses about client meetings or unexpected showings. When he was home, he seemed distracted, his eyes distant even during family dinners. Sophie, accustomed to his charm and attentiveness, brushed it off as work stress. After all, Jack had always been ambitious. Rebecca's visits became more frequent around this time, her presence almost reassuring. She brought Sophie coffee during hectic mornings, stayed late for movie nights with the kids, and even helped organize a neighborhood fundraiser. If anything, Rebecca seemed more invested in Sophie's happiness than ever before. Yet, in moments of solitude, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, a vital detail hidden in plain sight. She dismissed her doubts, convincing herself that her husband's weariness and her best friend's unwavering support were coincidences. Little did she know, the bonds she cherished most were about to unravel in ways she could never have imagined. Jack Richards had always been the life of the room. His quick wit, engaging stories, and effortless charm made him the kind of man people gravitated toward. But lately, Sophie noticed that the vibrant man she married seemed to be slipping away, piece by piece. The confident smiles that once lit up a room were replaced by distant gazes, his laughter now rare and hollow. He often came home late, muttering about demanding clients and tough negotiations. His phone was always within arm's reach, screen tilted away, buzzing with notifications that he never explained. Sophie, ever the supportive wife, chalked it up to the pressures of his job. Real estate was a cutthroat business, and Jack had poured himself into it, determined to give their family the best life possible. But deep down, an unsettling feeling gnawed at her, a whisper she couldn't silence. The change didn't go unnoticed by Rebecca Morgan. Always observant, Rebecca had a way of sensing the shifts in people's lives, a skill she often attributed to her years as a single woman navigating the complexities of relationships. Over wine in Sophie's kitchen one evening, Rebecca casually brought it up. "Jack seems different these days," she said, swirling her glass, her tone light but laced with curiosity. "Is everything okay?" Sophie hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I think he's just stressed. Work has been crazy lately. You know how he is, always trying to do it all." Rebecca nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Men like Jack, they put so much pressure on themselves. Sometimes they just need someone who understands them." The comment lingered in Sophie's mind long after Rebecca left. She tried to dismiss it as well-meaning advice, but there was something about the way Rebecca said it that felt off. Still, she trusted Rebecca. She had no reason not to. Meanwhile, Jack's late nights grew more frequent. He claimed he was hosting private showings for high-profile clients or attending networking events. Sophie believed him, at least, she tried to. But then there were the little things, the way he'd quickly turn his phone face down when she walked into the room, or how he'd offer vague answers when she asked about his day. Once, she noticed the faint scent of an unfamiliar perfume on his shirt. He brushed it off, saying he had hugged a client at a closing celebration. Rebecca's presence in their lives also seemed to increase during this time. She dropped by unannounced more often, always with some excuse, a bottle of wine to share, a casserole she had baked too much of, or simply to check in on Sophie. She was attentive, always ready to lend an ear, her questions probing just enough to seem caring without crossing the line. For Jack, Rebecca became a quiet escape from the growing tension at home. What started as casual conversations evolved into something more. She listened without judgment, her eyes filled with understanding that felt absent in his strained interactions with Sophie. It was in these moments that Jack began to see Rebecca in a new light, not as Sophie's best friend, but as a woman who seemed to see the version of him he had lost. Rebecca, for her part, played her role flawlessly. She was careful, calculated, ensuring her actions appeared innocent. But beneath her warm smiles and comforting words, there was a spark, a subtle shift in her demeanor when Jack was around. She laughed a little louder at his jokes, lingered a little longer when handing him a glass of wine. It was so subtle that even Sophie, who prided herself on her intuition, didn't see it for what it was. Sophie, however, couldn't ignore the growing distance in her marriage. Their once effortless conversations now felt like work, every word carefully chosen to avoid conflict. Jack no longer reached for her hand during their evening walks, and even their shared silences felt heavy, filled with things left unsaid. She began to wonder if she was imagining it, if the stress of her responsibilities and Jack's demanding schedule had clouded her judgment. In moments of doubt, Sophie turned to Rebecca for reassurance. "Do you think I'm overthinking things?" she asked one afternoon, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Maybe I'm just reading too much into it." Rebecca placed a comforting hand on Sophie's shoulder. "You're an amazing wife, Sophie. Jack is lucky to have you. Men go through phases, it's probably nothing." It was the perfect response, designed to keep Sophie's trust intact while allowing Rebecca to remain close to both of them. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that her marriage was slipping through her fingers. And the deeper the cracks grew, the more Rebecca seemed to fill the spaces Jack left behind. What Sophie didn't know was that those cracks were no accident. They were widening, carefully, deliberately. And Rebecca was already planning how to step through. The unease that Sophie had been trying so hard to suppress finally began to take root. Jack's behavior had shifted from distant to almost evasive. Gone were the occasional excuses, now, his absences were more frequent, his explanations even thinner. His once warm goodnight kisses felt like afterthoughts, and his laughter, a sound Sophie adored, had become increasingly rare. The Jack she knew was slipping further away, and Sophie was no longer willing to ignore the signs. The first real clue came on an otherwise ordinary evening. Sophie was sorting laundry when she noticed something odd, a faint trace of lipstick on the collar of Jack's dress shirt. It wasn't her shade. Her heart sank, but she quickly dismissed it. Maybe it was an accident, a smudge from a colleague's cheek during a friendly hug. Jack worked in real estate, after all, such things weren't unheard of. Yet the unease in her chest refused to subside. Her intuition whispered louder the next day when she walked into the kitchen to find Jack hurriedly locking his phone. The screen went dark before she could see who he was texting. He laughed it off, claiming it was a work client, but the forced casualness of his tone only heightened her unease. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Jack seemed unusually distracted. He barely engaged with the children and gave Sophie short, clipped answers to her questions. When she asked if something was bothering him, he simply shook his head, mumbling something about being tired. Sophie studied his face, searching for the man she married, but all she saw was someone who felt like a stranger. Rebecca, as always, was her sounding board. Sophie confided in her best friend over coffee, sharing her fears and doubts. "Do you think I'm being paranoid?" she asked, stirring her mug absent-mindedly. "Jack just feels different lately. I can't put my finger on it." Rebecca, calm and composed, offered her usual reassurance. "Sophie, you're overthinking. Men go through phases. It's probably just work stress. You two have such a strong relationship, don't let little things get in your head." Rebecca's words should have comforted her, but instead, they left Sophie feeling more uncertain. Rebecca's tone was too smooth, too dismissive. And as Sophie replayed their conversation later that night, she realized something: Rebecca had offered no real advice, only vague platitudes. For someone who knew Sophie so well, her best friend seemed oddly uninvested in her concerns. Sophie began to notice more inconsistencies. Jack would leave for client meetings, dressed more sharply than usual, wearing cologne she hadn't seen him use in years. His work schedule seemed to stretch into the late hours of the night, yet when she casually called his office one evening, no one picked up. Even more troubling was the way he avoided her touch, pulling away as if the simplest gestures of affection had become unbearable. One afternoon, Sophie decided to act on her growing suspicion. She carefully picked up Jack's phone while he showered, her heart pounding as she unlocked the screen. She scrolled through his messages, finding nothing incriminating, until she opened his recently deleted folder. There, hidden away, were snippets of conversations with someone listed only as R. Her blood ran cold as she realized who it had to be: Rebecca. The texts were vague enough to maintain plausible deniability but intimate enough to shatter Sophie's trust. Phrases like "last night was amazing" and "can't wait to see you again" leapt off the screen. Her hands shook as she read, each word a dagger to her heart. Sophie's mind raced, piecing together the countless moments she had overlooked, the extra glasses of wine Rebecca had shared with Jack, the lingering glances, the late-night visits under the guise of friendship. But what hurt the most wasn't just Jack's betrayal, it was Rebecca's. The woman she had trusted like a sister, who had been her confidant, her partner in every aspect of life, had stabbed her in the back. The realization was crushing, leaving Sophie breathless and lightheaded. She clutched the phone, unsure of what to do next. Her world felt as though it was crumbling around her, the foundations of her life ripped apart by two people she loved most. That night, Sophie confronted Jack. Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and devastation as she demanded answers. Jack, cornered, admitted to the affair but insisted it had been a mistake. "It didn't mean anything," he pleaded. "I was lost, Sophie. I didn't know how to talk to you about what I was feeling." But Sophie wasn't convinced. "You didn't know how to talk to me, so you talked to Rebecca," she spat, her voice rising. "My best friend. The person I trusted the most." Jack hung his head in shame, offering no defense. Rebecca, when confronted, was unapologetic. "You weren't there for him, Sophie," she said coldly. "I was." For Sophie, it was the final blow. The betrayal cut deeper than she thought possible, leaving her questioning everything she once believed about love, trust, and friendship. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The weight of Sophie's discovery crushed her from the inside out. The texts on Jack's phone were the final confirmation of what she had dreaded, but somehow never fully acknowledged. The world she had built, her family, her trust in Jack, her bond with Rebecca, felt like it was shattering into irreparable pieces. The faces of her children, their innocent smiles, seemed distant now, tainted by the brutal truth Sophie had unearthed. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, the images of Jack and Rebecca together, hidden away in their own world, looping over and over in her head. Each sentence she had read between them felt like a stab to her heart. She barely slept, restless and sickened by the betrayal. Sophie tossed and turned, haunted by the harsh reality she could no longer escape. By morning, the dark cloud still hung over her. Jack slept beside her, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside her. Sophie stared at the back of his head, knowing what she had to do next. She couldn't live like this. She couldn't pretend to be okay. It was time to confront him. But this time, there would be no room for denial. As the first rays of dawn peeked through the blinds, Sophie got out of bed, feeling as if she was moving through a fog. Her every step was heavy, every breath a struggle. She walked to the kitchen, her heart pounding, her mind racing with the words she'd rehearsed 100 times in her head. When Jack finally woke up and walked into the kitchen, his usual cheerful greeting didn't come. Instead, Sophie turned to him, her eyes piercing. "I know about you and Rebecca," she said, her voice calm but with an edge of anger she could no longer hide. Her hands were steady, but inside, she was trembling. This was the moment that would change everything. Jack froze. The color drained from his face as he looked at her, guilt flooding his expression. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His eyes flickered to the phone in Sophie's hands, and the tension between them thickened. "You've been lying to me for months, Jack," Sophie continued, her voice barely above a whisper now, her throat tightening. "You were sleeping with my best friend, my sister." Her voice broke on the last word, the pain spilling out of her. She hadn't realized just how deeply this wound would go. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the complete rupture of everything she had trusted. Jack tried to move toward her, but she stepped back. "No, don't come near me," Sophie snapped, holding up the phone. "I have everything right here, Jack. Every damn word between you and Rebecca. Don't you dare try to deny it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jack opened his mouth again, finally managing to say, "Sophie, I trusted you," she cut him off. "I believed in us. And you betrayed me with her. With my best friend, Jack." The tears she had held back for so long began to spill freely, each drop a testament to the hurt that consumed her. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." Jack's face twisted with regret, but the damage was done. He knew this was the moment that could tear them apart forever. "I'm so sorry, Sophie," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I don't know what came over me." Sophie shook her head, her breath hitching. "You chose this, Jack. You chose her." The realization hit her hard, deeper than anything else. She wasn't just hurt, she was disgusted. She wasn't just betrayed by her husband, she was betrayed by someone she had called her sister. Someone who had known all of her secrets, her fears, her vulnerabilities, and still chose to betray her trust. But Sophie couldn't stay here, drowning in the suffocating pain any longer. She grabbed her bag and began gathering her things. Jack, watching her, stepped forward, but Sophie was resolute. She wasn't going to let him manipulate her into feeling sorry for him. She had spent years loving him, trusting him, but the man standing before her was no longer the Jack she had married. "What are you doing?" Jack asked, his voice breaking. "Sophie, please, we can fix this. We can work through this together. I made a mistake. I'll end it with Rebecca. I'll do whatever it takes. Sophie's heart ached at his words. But she was beyond the point of redemption now. She couldn't go back. Not after this. I can't, she whispered, the finality of the words weighing heavily in her chest. I can't look at you the same way anymore. You've destroyed everything, Jack. You've destroyed us. She left before he could say another word, the door slamming shut behind her as she stepped into the uncertain future that awaited her. As the car engine roared to life, Sophie's thoughts spun wildly. What was she supposed to do now? How could she possibly heal from this? But for the first time in months, Sophie felt a spark of clarity. She would rebuild. She would recover. Her heart might be broken, but she wasn't going to let this define her. She had loved with everything she had, and now it was time to love herself, to choose herself. The pain would come, of course. It would come in waves, relentless and unforgiving. But Sophie knew now, beyond any doubt, that the truth had set her free, even if it had torn everything she knew apart. And as for Rebecca, she had crossed the line. And Sophie would make sure she faced the consequences of her actions. But for now, Sophie had one priority: healing. The days following Sophie's departure were marked by a deep and unrelenting silence in the Richards' home. Jack, consumed by guilt and regret, wandered through the house like a ghost, lost in his thoughts, trying to understand the consequences of his actions. His heart, once filled with the promises of his family and the love he had for Sophie, now felt hollow. He had ruined everything. Sophie had left, taking their children with her, leaving the house eerily quiet. Jack knew he had to do something, he couldn't let it end this way. But his mind was clouded, and his sense of shame had consumed him entirely. He couldn't face Sophie, couldn't beg her to come back. She had made it clear that there was no turning back. The betrayal was too deep. His betrayal was unforgivable. And then there was Rebecca. Her absence in Jack's life felt like a sharp, stinging void. He had become tangled in the chaos of his own decisions, but now he couldn't shake the thought of her. Despite everything, despite how he had broken Sophie's heart, despite the lies they had both told, Rebecca's face haunted him. She had been his refuge, his escape, and now she was lost to him. Sophie had cut her off, and Jack could feel the distance growing between them, too. What had started as a passionate affair had turned into something dark, something dangerous, and now, there was no turning back for any of them. Rebecca, however, wasn't ready to let go. Her obsession had become too deep, her desire for Jack too consuming. The rejection had pushed her past the point of reason. She wasn't going to accept this new reality. She had already lost so much, and now, with Sophie and Jack pushing her out of their lives, she was angry. Furious. And her anger was quickly turning to madness. Rebecca's obsession spiraled out of control in the days after Sophie left. She tried calling Jack several times, leaving messages, but they went unanswered. He had gone silent, avoiding any communication with her. She tried reaching out to Sophie, but Sophie's response was the same, cold, distant, and final. Sophie wasn't interested in forgiveness. It was over. The bitterness in Rebecca grew like a storm, swirling around her every waking moment. She couldn't stand it. She had given so much, trusted so much, and for what? To be cast aside like some fleeting affair. To watch as Jack returned to his family, leaving her behind in a cold, empty world. She couldn't accept it. On the evening of March 12th, Rebecca drove to the Richards' home, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale and trembling with fury. She had one thing on her mind: to confront Jack. To demand answers. To make him see how wrong he was, how everything could have been different if only he had chosen her. The neighborhood was quiet that night, the street lamps casting soft pools of light on the paved road. Most of the homes were dark, their inhabitants settled in for the night. The Richards house loomed ahead, its windows dark and still. Rebecca parked her car a few blocks away and walked slowly toward the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a mix of dread and anticipation, a need to confront Jack that overshadowed every other thought. As she approached the front door, she hesitated for a moment, her mind clouded with rage. The image of Sophie's face, the woman who had everything she wanted, the woman who had taken Jack away from her, flashed in her mind. But this wasn't about Sophie anymore. This was about Jack. This was about Rebecca's claim on him, about the love and passion she had believed they shared. And she wasn't going to let it end like this. Rebecca knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet night. She waited, and after a few moments, Jack opened the door. His face was worn, his eyes tired. When he saw her standing there, his expression shifted from surprise to confusion, and then to something that could have been regret, but there was no time for explanations. "Jack," Rebecca said, her voice trembling but sharp, "we need to talk." He didn't invite her in, but he didn't stop her either. She walked past him into the living room, her eyes scanning the house, the place where she had once shared so many moments with him. But now, it felt foreign. Empty. She felt like an intruder. "What do you want, Rebecca?" Jack asked, his voice flat, almost defeated. "I've told you, it's over. Sophie knows. She's left." Rebecca's eyes burned with fury. "You think I care about Sophie? This isn't about her. It's about you, about us. What happened to us, Jack? You were supposed to choose me." Jack took a step back, shaking his head. "I made a mistake, Rebecca. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I'm sorry. I was confused, but I never meant for any of this to happen." "You never meant for this to happen?" Rebecca's voice rose, sharp and biting. "You think I care about your apologies? You think that's enough? After everything we've been through?" Jack's face paled as Rebecca's words hit him. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken rage. But Rebecca's anger had reached a boiling point, and in a single moment, it exploded. She lunged at Jack, pushing him with all her might. He staggered back, crashing into the coffee table, knocking over a vase. But it wasn't the fall that made him gasp, it was what Rebecca did next. She pulled out a knife, its steel gleaming in the dim light. Jack's eyes widened in horror, but before he could react, Rebecca was on him. Her hands shook, but the rage driving her was too strong. With one swift motion, she thrust the knife into his chest. Jack gasped, his hands instinctively going to the wound, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Blood began to pool beneath him as he collapsed to the floor, the life draining from his eyes. Rebecca stood frozen for a moment, staring at the carnage she had caused. The reality of what she had just done hit her like a ton of bricks, and panic surged through her veins. Her mind raced, what had she done? She had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. She dropped the knife, her breath ragged as she turned and fled into the night. Jack's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, his final moments spent in the house that had once been full of life and laughter. As the night fell into silence, the house would never be the same again. The silence that followed the horrific events of that night was broken only by the distant sound of sirens. Sophie had barely made it out of town, still reeling from the revelations about Jack and Rebecca. She hadn't seen or heard from Jack since the confrontation, and part of her hoped she never would again. But the morning of March 13th, the call came, the call that would change everything for her and for the rest of the people involved. Sophie sat in the small apartment she had rented temporarily, still holding on to the shattered pieces of her heart. The phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. She hesitated for a moment, knowing instinctively that this wasn't a call she wanted to receive. But when the voice on the other end introduced themselves as Detective Kate Alvarado from the Scottsdale Police Department, Sophie's world froze. Ms. Richards, I'm afraid I have some very bad news. Detective Alvarado's voice was calm but firm. We found your husband. He's dead. Murdered, in fact. We believe he was attacked in your home last night. The news hit Sophie like a physical blow. She felt her knees go weak, her head spinning. Jack, she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. What happened? Who did this? We're still investigating, but we believe it was a targeted attack. We need you to come in for questioning. Can you do that, Ms. Richards? Sophie's mind raced. The image of Jack, bloodied, lifeless, lying on the floor of their home, was too much for her to bear. But she couldn't deny the knot tightening in her stomach. Rebecca. She had to be involved. But how? Why? Sophie's gut told her this was far from over. The detective arranged for Sophie to meet at the police station later that afternoon. When she arrived, her hands shook as she was led into a small interrogation room. Sophie could barely focus on the questions the detective asked, her mind still trapped in the horror of the night before. She answered mechanically, but inside, she was trembling. She couldn't understand why Rebecca would do this. The woman who had been her friend, her confidant, had crossed a line that would never be erased. Do you know of anyone who might want to hurt your husband? Detective Alvarado asked. Sophie tried to think. Jack had been well-liked, successful, respected in the community. There was no reason for anyone to harm him. Except for one person. One very dangerous person. Rebecca, Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper. Rebecca Morgan. She and Jack, they had an affair. The detective took note of Sophie's words but didn't immediately respond. Do you think Rebecca would hurt Jack? Kate asked. Sophie struggled to keep her composure. I don't know, she said, shaking her head. But after everything, after what I found out, I don't think she'd stop at anything. I just don't know how far she'd go. Detective Alvarado nodded and stood. We'll investigate this further. We're going to need to speak with Rebecca as well. Sophie didn't know what to expect, but she knew that it wouldn't be long before Rebecca was under the police's scrutiny. And it wasn't long before the evidence started to paint a chilling picture. The police wasted no time in launching a full investigation into the murder of Jack Richards. They gathered forensic evidence, combing through the house for any sign of struggle or clues that might lead them to the killer. They quickly found that the scene of the crime was anything but random. Jack had been stabbed with a knife, violent and intimate, the kind of attack that spoke of personal anger. There were signs of a struggle, but they were minimal. Jack had likely been caught off guard, unaware of the danger until it was too late. It seemed that the attacker had been someone he knew, someone who had been allowed access into the home without suspicion. As the detectives continued their investigation, they found a key piece of evidence. Security footage from a neighboring house showed Rebecca's car parked near the Richards home around the time of the murder. The footage was grainy, but it was unmistakable. The image of Rebecca's car, unmistakably linked to her, drove a wedge deeper into the theory that she was involved in Jack's death. Detective Alvarado's team soon tracked down Rebecca. She was brought in for questioning, and at first, she denied any involvement in the murder. But her nervousness was obvious. Her answers were vague, and her behavior erratic. She fidgeted in her seat, her hands shaking, avoiding eye contact whenever the detective pressed her on specific details. You were seen near the Richards house last night, Detective Alvarado said, her voice steady but firm. Can you explain what you were doing there? Rebecca stammered, her face flushing with anxiety. I didn't do anything. I just wanted to talk to Jack. I knew Sophie was gone, and I thought maybe we could talk. Work things out. Did you have a knife with you? The detective pressed. Rebecca faltered, looking down at her hands. I didn't hurt him. I swear. I just wanted to see him. I didn't mean to. The detective cut her off. "You're going to need to tell us everything, Rebecca. We found a knife with blood on it. We found it in a dumpster near your house. We found blood on your clothes. And we know you were there. It's only a matter of time before the rest of the evidence comes together." The truth was beginning to unravel. Rebecca's once strong facade began to crumble. Detective Alvarado's team had found more damning evidence, including texts between Rebecca and Jack in the weeks leading up to the murder, texts that painted a portrait of obsession and desperation. As the interrogation continued, Rebecca's story faltered. She began to contradict herself, revealing more than she intended. She was finally cornered. "I didn't mean to hurt him," Rebecca sobbed, her voice breaking. "I loved him. I thought if I could just get him back, everything would be okay. I didn't want it to end like this." But it was too late for apologies. The evidence against Rebecca was undeniable. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became clear, Rebecca had murdered Jack, driven by jealousy, betrayal, and an all-consuming obsession that had pushed her to the edge. She was arrested and charged with murder, the last remnants of her former life slipping away as she was led out of the station in handcuffs. The truth was finally exposed, and the secrets that had been buried for so long were brought into the light. The once perfect life of the Richards family was destroyed, and for Sophie, the painful process of moving forward had only just begun. The courtroom was packed. The tension in the air was palpable as the community of Scottsdale, Arizona, sat in anticipation of the trial that had captured the public's attention. The murder of Jack Richards, by someone who was supposed to be a close friend of his wife, had shocked the entire town. The proceedings, though heavy with grief, would serve as a public reckoning, the final step in unraveling the twisted web of betrayal, obsession, and murder that had shattered one of the community's most respected families. Rebecca Morgan sat at the defense table, her face pale and drawn. Gone was the confident, charming woman who once lit up every room she entered. In her place sat a woman whose once vibrant personality had been erased by guilt, fear, and the weight of her actions. Her hands trembled in her lap as she waited for the trial to begin, her eyes occasionally glancing at the family members and friends seated in the courtroom, but she quickly looked away each time. She couldn't face them, not after what she had done. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting the case. The evidence was overwhelming. Detective Kate Alvarado's testimony painted a clear picture of Rebecca's obsession with Jack Richards. The texts between Rebecca and Jack, messages that had once seemed innocent to her but were now irrefutable evidence of her deepening emotional and physical involvement, were read aloud in the courtroom. The words, dripping with longing and desperation, seemed to echo in the silence, each one a reminder of Rebecca's role in the events that led to Jack's murder. The prosecution also presented the forensic evidence, the knife, found discarded near Rebecca's home, stained with Jack's blood, the security footage of Rebecca's car parked near the Richards house on the night of the murder, and the DNA evidence that confirmed Rebecca's presence at the scene. The case against her was airtight. Rebecca's defense team tried to argue that she had been emotionally manipulated by Jack, that her actions were driven by a mix of rejection and mental distress. They tried to paint her as a woman pushed to the brink by love unrequited, a victim of circumstance, and not a murderer. But their arguments felt weak, hollow, and rehearsed. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Rebecca's jealousy and obsession had led her to a moment of uncontrollable rage. The defense couldn't escape the harsh truth of what she had done. Sophie sat in the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the woman who had once been her best friend. She hadn't spoken to Rebecca since the night of Jack's murder, and as she listened to the testimony, a coldness settled over her. The pain of what had happened, of the years of friendship she had lost, of the betrayal she had endured, was still fresh, but it had been joined by something else, anger. Anger at Rebecca for taking everything from her, for destroying the life she had worked so hard to build. Sophie's testimony came next. She spoke with a calmness that seemed almost impossible considering the gravity of what she had endured. She recounted her discovery of Jack's affair, her confrontation with both him and Rebecca, and the devastation she felt when she realized that her closest friend had become the architect of her pain. Sophie didn't hold back. She talked about the sleepless nights, the way her heart had broken with each new piece of evidence. She spoke about the children, about how their lives had been shattered by Rebecca's actions. Rebecca's face was unreadable as Sophie spoke. She didn't look up, didn't meet Sophie's eyes. Sophie couldn't bring herself to look at her either. The anger was too much, too raw. The trial dragged on for weeks, and the weight of the testimonies grew heavier with each passing day. The community watched as the life of a family that had once seemed perfect was laid bare in front of them. They heard about Jack's infidelity, about Sophie's pain, and about the lengths to which Rebecca had gone to keep her obsessive love affair with Jack alive. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. The prosecutor stood before the jury, his voice firm and unyielding. Rebecca Morgan's actions were not those of a victim. They were those of a woman consumed by jealousy, a woman whose obsessive desire for a man who had already chosen his family drove her to murder. She took Jack's life, and in doing so, she destroyed the lives of everyone who loved him. She cannot be allowed to walk free. The defense attorney's argument, though emotional, did little to sway the jury. He spoke of Rebecca's past struggles with loneliness, of her troubled childhood, and of her emotional breakdown after being rejected by Jack. Rebecca didn't want to kill Jack, he argued. She didn't mean for any of this to happen. She was a woman in pain, and in her desperation, she made a terrible mistake. But the jury wasn't swayed. They had seen the evidence. They had heard Sophie's testimony. They understood the extent of Rebecca's obsession, and they knew that the actions Rebecca took were deliberate, fueled by a toxic combination of rage and possessiveness. It wasn't a mistake, it was murder. The jury deliberated for less than a day before reaching a verdict. Rebecca Morgan was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge's gavel slammed down, the sound reverberating through the courtroom, and Rebecca's face remained stoic, though the faintest trace of relief seemed to wash over her. She had expected this verdict, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. The sentence came shortly after, 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The punishment was severe, but it was what Rebecca deserved. She had taken the life of a man who had meant everything to his family and friends. And she had taken everything from Sophie. As Rebecca was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Sophie felt a small, bittersweet sense of closure. This was the end of the trial, but it would never be the end of the pain. The damage had been done. Her family had been torn apart, and the scars would remain for a lifetime. Rebecca's fate was sealed, but for Sophie, the journey toward healing was just beginning. The finality of Rebecca's conviction left an eerie silence in its wake. The courtroom doors had closed, but for Sophie, the true battle had just begun. She had won her case, the justice system had held Rebecca accountable for the murder of Jack, but nothing could erase the pain that had been inflicted on her life. The weight of betrayal was a heavy burden, and despite the conviction, it offered her no relief. In the weeks following the trial, Sophie tried to piece together the fragments of her life. She and her children moved to a small house on the outskirts of Scottsdale, far from the mansion that had once been their home. The house was modest, but it was theirs, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt the weight of the past lifting, even if only a little. She focused on rebuilding her life, one step at a time, and creating a safe, stable environment for her children. But no matter how hard she tried to move on, the memories of Jack and Rebecca were always lurking in the background, threatening to overtake her every moment of peace. Her children, too, struggled. They had lost their father in the most brutal and incomprehensible way, and Sophie had to help them process a pain she could barely begin to understand herself. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt quiet and empty. Sophie did her best to shield them from the complexities of adult emotions, but they saw her tears when she thought they weren't looking. They knew something had been broken, even if they didn't have the words to express it. Rebecca's fate seemed to fade from public view as the months went on, but for Sophie, the the scar remained fresh. She couldn't help but replay the moments of her life with Rebecca, their late-night talks, their shared memories, the way they had once been like sisters. All of it had been a lie. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Jack had done. Rebecca had been the one person Sophie had trusted above all others, and she had not only deceived her, but destroyed the foundation of her entire world. In the early mornings, after the children had gone to school, Sophie would sit in the quiet of her new home and think about what she had lost. She thought of Jack, his charm, his smiles, the man she had married. And she thought of Rebecca, and the way her presence had once felt like a comfort, only to become the source of Sophie's deepest wounds. She would never forgive them, not fully. Some things could never be healed, no matter how much time passed. Still, Sophie had made a choice. She had chosen to live, to keep going for her children, for herself. The world she had known was gone, and she couldn't change that. But she could rebuild. She began seeing a therapist to work through the trauma, to try and understand how she had allowed herself to be so blind to the signs of betrayal. Slowly, she began to accept that some things weren't meant to be understood, they were just part of life's painful, unpredictable course. The case had brought closure in a legal sense, but closure in her heart was something Sophie realized she would have to find on her own. She would never again trust someone the way she had trusted Rebecca. She would never allow herself to be so vulnerable in the face of betrayal. Yet, there was a quiet strength within her, a resolve to rise above the chaos that had threatened to break her. It was a painful kind of strength, forged in the fires of loss and deception. As for Rebecca, she spent her days behind bars, far removed from the life she had once known. The vibrant woman who had been a constant presence in the neighborhood, the one who had shared every joy and sorrow with Sophie, was now a prisoner of her own choices. Her trial had been the beginning of the end, but the consequences of her actions would haunt her for the rest of her life. The life she had built, however fragile it seemed, was gone, and there was no escape from the reality of her crime. In a sense, Sophie had already begun to let go. Her anger had softened, though the hurt was still there. She had been broken, yes, but she had also been rebuilt. Her children were safe. They were loved. And she had learned to find hope again, even in the most unlikely places. Life would never be the same. The shadows of the past would always follow her, but Sophie had come to accept that there was no undoing what had been done. Instead, she focused on the future. She focused on herself and her children. She focused on healing. In the end, Sophie knew that the most important thing wasn't seeking revenge, or even understanding the motivations behind the betrayal. It was about finding peace within herself. The scars would remain, but they would no longer define her. She had taken back control of her life. And though the past could never be erased, the future, her future, was still hers to shape. And as for Rebecca, the punishment was not just in the prison sentence she would serve, but in the realization that she had thrown away everything for a love that had never been hers to claim. For Sophie, the healing would take time. But she knew, in her heart, that she would survive this. She would rise above it. And maybe, just maybe, she would one day find peace.